Okay, today I'm going to talk about behavior and wildlife conservation. We're going to start by highlighting the ways in which behavior is important in some of the previous themes that we've covered, and also introduce you to some new concepts in behavior. So, just an overview of the definition of behavior. This is what you would look up if you did a search in a web browser for behavior, and an Oxford definition. The first one really focuses on human behavior, how one conducts oneself towards, especially when it has to do with others. But when we're talking about animal behavior, it's a little bit different, and it's defined as the way in which an animal or person acts in response to a particular situation. We often call that a stimulus. What is the stimulus for that behavior? The thing about the environment that instigates the behavior. And so, as we're thinking of behavior, I'm going to pull on some of these previous themes. So, one of the first things we talked about was diversity in an environment, or species richness in an environment, and the typical patterns we tend to observe. One is patterns of rareness and abundance. So this is a rank abundance plot of birds in our campus forest. We did rank abundance and did diversity indices towards the beginning of the quarter. And one of the important things to remember is that most species in an environment are rare. And there are reasons why they are rare. There are reasons why the common individuals are common. In this example of our campus forest, some of our most common breeding birds are birds like Pacific wren. It's a small understory insectivore. There's another bird called Swainson's thrush that migrates up here to breed, also an understory insectivore. And they're using a really common resource that's available during the breeding season in the environment. And that is dark forest understory and an abundance of insects and arthropods in their environment. And they tend to carve out pretty small territories. For Pacific wrens, it's about an acre in size. So the campus forests can hold a lot of Pacific wren territories. And they're behaving these territories by defending the boundaries of their territories and by also singing. This is part of the territory defense and also part of the mating behavior of this species. Out here, with most of these rare birds, their environmental requirements are somewhat more dispersed, or they just need a larger area to gain enough energy to sustain themselves. So one type of more rare organism here with our birds would be some of the raptors that actually feed on birds like Pacific wrens, birds like Cooper's hawks. They are having to search the environment for these animals and take opportunities when that animal's out in the open to capture it. Okay, and they're feeding these birds, not only them to themselves, but to their young during the breeding season. We saw pileated woodpeckers towards the beginning of the year out in the field. They're also really rare in our campus forest, in part because they need large snags that have carpenter ants in them. They need enough of these to sustain themselves and to produce offspring. They also need trees with adequate cavities in them. So this limits their population size and it affects the way they behave. And so they tend to maintain pretty large territories pretty aggressively once they find an environment that has enough carpenter ants and the adequate breeding space. We talked about fishers just a few weeks ago, and we had a visitor talking about translocations. And one of the examples was the reintroduction of the fisher into Washington State. Now, fishers, just a review, are a type of weasel. They're in the family Mustelidae. They are relatively large in size. You can see this one here that's being released at Mount Rainier. And although they're large, their territories are actually surprisingly large given their size. Their home ranges are up to 19 square miles, or actually can be even larger than that in the northern parts of their range. They tend to eat mammals such as rabbits, voles, moles, and they have to move long distances to find these animals. They also tend to be pretty restricted to heavily coniferous forest environments. And so knowing this about them influenced how researchers decided would be the best way to track them. Okay, so this is an animal that is fairly secretive. It has a large territory, so encountering one on any given day is not a high probability. They're solitary. They tend to only be found with other fishers during the mating season or when a female has young. And so the decision to track them using radio transmitters for some individuals was informed by this behavior. Using something like a transmitter can have potentially have an impact on the animal. And so people really weigh the costs and benefits when it comes to making that kind of decision. And because it was really one of the most feasible ways to be able to track the success of the reintroduction to see if it was worth this effort, if it would be worth future effort, they needed to do that. They also set up a pretty extensive grid of camera traps that helped them not only track where the animals were, but to look to see if they were reproducing. And you may remember that they had some images of Fisher and a young. We talked about population biology and age structure in populations, how that's important. This often plays out when you're looking at animals. Say you're looking at a type of species, you're trying to understand what's happening with its population. A lot of this actually plays out as behavior. And you may see behavior that is unique to one or the other sex or is unique to different age groups of animals. And understanding these behaviors can be really important to understanding why the animal may have a life history strategy that makes it maybe more vulnerable or has the life history strategy that it does. And so some things to think about when we're thinking about that behavior is that there are trade-offs, okay, in the energy that an animal can expend for different activities in its life. In this case, we're talking about trade-offs between fecundity. So this is the number of offspring that an animal will rear. We usually measure this within a season, within a breeding time. It can also be measured over the lifetime of the animal. But so that takes energy, and then the energy that it takes to survive. And so this is a plot of fecundity. And so you can think of this is for a European kestrel. These are small falcons. They look pretty similar to American kestrels, and they readily nest in boxes. So they've been studied to a good degree to understand these life history traits. And when you look at the number of eggs in a kestrel box and then map out over time adult survival, what you find is this sort of threshold effect that past about 5 eggs, the probability of the adult that's having the eggs surviving from 1 year to the next drops. So there is an actual direct cost of having more offspring in terms of survival. Okay, more offspring equals lower survival, higher mortality. They actually did a series of studies that actually tested this directly because birds with nest boxes can be involved in these kinds of studies. So you know where the nest is and you can see the individuals that are laying eggs in the nest. And this was a study in which they did a manipulation. They would take an egg from one clutch. So many of these kestrels tended to lay 2 eggs and 2 or 3 eggs, and they would remove 1 egg from one clutch and then add it to another. And so what they ended up with were nests that had no eggs removed. And in those cases, they actually would pick up an egg and put it back down, but leave the clutch intact. Eggs that had fewer, a reduced clutch. This is the triangles, is the reduced clutch. The control or the nest that had no eggs removed. And then there were some boxes where that removed egg got added to another box. So the birds ended up with an additional egg in their clutch, one more egg than they had laid. And they tracked the survival of the adults, not of the young of the clutch, but the adults that were rearing the young over a season. So this starting in June. And so what you see is a dip by about the end of the breeding season in the birds that had enlarged clutches, and then a really dramatic drop in survival into the winter. Okay, so the birds that had one egg added to their clutch had much lower survival than the birds that had a regular size clutch or one fewer egg. And these look a little different, but they didn't significantly differ, the control and the reduced clutch nests. And so, understanding this, to understand why this is the case, they looked at the behavior of these birds during the breeding season and they measured certain behaviors. And based on what they knew about the metabolic rates of the kestrels, they were able to sort of estimate the amount of energy it took to do these different things. And so, here are just some metrics here. So one of the things they measured was how many hours a day the males and the females were flying. Okay, and so you can see in the reduced control and enlarged clutches, there were different males and females were flying more every day when they had more eggs. And they're flying to get food to provision the young. And so they looked at flight and sort of calculated energy expenditure. So this is kilojoules per day for males and for females. Let's see, do we have male energy expenditure? Looks like we don't have female energy expenditure here, but you can see this for males. Hunting yield. So this is how much they're bringing back to their nest. So they're spending more time looking for food. Are they bringing back more food? And the answer was yes. The individuals with that are bringing back food to the nest with more eggs are bringing back more food. So that flying was really effective. They were actually capturing more items to feed more young. So when we look at female, we're also looking at female food intake per day. And so females that had larger clutches were intaking more food. And then how much food they were intaking per nestling per day was also measured. And so this was the interesting one. So the females are mostly the ones brooding, incubating the eggs and brooding the young. The males are doing most of the feeding. And so when a male would bring a food item to a box, you're not always 100% sure if it's the female eating that food item or if it's the young. But you can look at sort of the total amount of food coming in and sort of divide it by the number of nestlings. Okay. And so the food intake per nestling was higher in these reduced nests, but it really wasn't any different between the control and the enlarged. And so that food intake per clutch maintained itself. So these offspring, and then the survival of the offspring from these boxes was similar between reduced control and enlarged. So the offspring were not paying that cost of having an extra sibling. That was being compensated for by the parents spending a lot more energy feeding those young. What the cost was with the parents. And so if we go back to this slide, what happened is that these parents did not have enough energy stores to actually survive a winter during this time of low food availability. They weren't entering that hard season in good enough condition to survive. So they paid that cost in terms of mortality. So this is where behavior becomes really important. These animals are searching for food. They're upping their energy intake. They're changing their behavior to provision extra young. And we looked at behaviors when we were looking at age structure in gull populations. So I'm going to just show a couple of videos and talk a little bit about how we might think of these different behaviors being part of the life history of these gulls. Okay, I'm going to start this video and you can watch it, but these are Western gulls. This is an adult. This is a juvenile. It is reasonable to assume that this adult is the parent to this juvenile. And what you can see here is the adults picking at maybe food items, and the juvenile is going after the bill of the adult. They're expecting to be fed. They've been fed throughout their breeding season, and they're still behaving in a way that would encourage the adult to feed them. And so the adult is spending quite a bit of time avoiding feeding that young individual, and that young is actually expending a fair amount of energy trying to get food rather than trying to forage for food on its own. And then this is eventually what happens. The adult leaves. Okay, and then here's another video of something you may have seen gulls doing on our Evergreen Beach and other places around here, and this is clam dropping. So that gull had a clam in its mouth, it dropped it. Look what happens almost immediately. I'm going to pause it. This bird that just flew in is a subadult individual. It is queuing right into this adult that just dropped the clam. And then there's this interaction, this competitive interaction, probably a competitive interaction. The adult bird that dropped the clam is chasing that subadult away. Now it's going to go try and drop the clam again. So the success rate of clam dropping is thought to be higher with adults. They seem to know how high and where to drop the clams. They're not always successful. Here it goes again. It's about to drop. Okay. So it dropped it again. And so it's thought that the success rate increases. And so maybe one of the reasons why these juveniles, one of the benefits to having a plumage that identifies an individual as juvenile is something about feeding. These gulls certainly have a learning curve when it comes to their foraging efficiency. And so they may be signaling to adults that might feed them. They may also, the adults may be also receiving a signal that these young individuals are not yet, haven't yet learned how to be very efficient at foraging, may not be ready to provision offspring because of their low foraging efficiency. That would be one hypothesis someone could test, looking at the linkage between sort of the structure of the population and the behaviors. Okay. Another thing we learned about was the theory of island biogeography, but also niche partitioning. So Robert MacArthur was responsible for this concept of niche partitioning and sort of the most famous seminal study that came out about it in the late 1950s when he studied very similar warblers in northeastern coniferous forests. And you can look at these images of these warblers. You can look at the sort of dimensions of their bill. They have very similar body size. They tend to be behaving very similarly. And so MacArthur was looking to see how they might be competing, since they're so similar, how they might be competing for resources. And what he found was they tended to behave differently. So they tended to forage for similar types of food items in conifer trees, but the areas that different species were tending to select for finding those food items differed from species to species. And this was probably, this is what MacArthur proposed, was that the benefit of this is that these similar species avoided competition behaviorally by choosing slightly different locations for foraging. This is another sort of niche partitioning study, pretty interesting one from just a few years ago, looking at the presence of carnivores in environments with different levels of disturbance. I'm going to kind of move my zoom around here. And so what they were looking at were, here are some of the carnivores they were looking at: wolves, coyotes, lynx. Actually, this is bobcat, red fox, gray fox, fisher, and pine marten. And they were looking at the abundances and the diets of these carnivores in different types of landscapes. And so the light colored dots, and you can see in this light colored frame here that says C, are areas that are not highly disturbed. And they created an index here, the human footprint index. And so the areas that are light with the light dots have a low human footprint index. Then you have this sort of salmon pink, that sort of mid-range human footprint index. And there's this satellite image here of an area with some signs, roads and airstrips and signs of human disturbance, and then much more disturbed areas with a high human footprint index indicated by red. And so that's what these dots represented in terms of how they were classifying the human footprint in these different environments using GIS and landscape satellite imagery. And this was all done around the Great Lakes area. And these donuts are showing us relative abundances of these different carnivores. So that was one thing they were looking at, is how abundant, dependent on the human footprint index, are these different carnivores. And so over here in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, this part of the Great Lakes area, you can see in this not very disturbed area, a fairly large portion of the carnivores in the area were wolves. And then you go to the more disturbed areas, you see this decrease in the relative number of wolves in that environment. By contrast, if you look at coyotes, which are in pink here, in the more disturbed areas, you see higher numbers of coyotes. Over here in New York, also in the Great Lakes, there weren't any wolves. And so the composition of the community was a little bit different, but we still see shifts here. In particular, one I noticed was gray fox, indicated by the gray here. Gray fox was present in the sort of low disturbance areas, but really absent and present in really low abundance in the higher disturbance areas, whereas red fox sort of had a consistent, not so predictable shift. And then fisher were more abundant in the more highly disturbed environments. And I'm just going to point out that this is the same species of fisher we have in Washington State, but their ecology and behavior is a little bit different in the eastern part of the range. They never sort of disappeared from the northeastern states where they occur. So they've always been a little bit more abundant, or have been for a long period of time. And they seem to be somewhat adapted to human disturbed environments. I'm going to go to the paper because there's another piece of this, not just the abundances, but how they are feeding on human sort of derived resources. Okay, so this is the paper. And so here is our imagery from the slide. This is looking at carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the environment, the enrichment of these isotopes. And so when you see they test by taking some tissue samples, hair samples, often from these animals, and they look for carbon and nitrogen enrichment. And higher levels indicate that they're consuming more human food, because that's a footprint of that environment. And so when they're feeding on more natural food sources, they have lower enrichment of these two isotopes. And when they're feeding more on human food, they have higher enrichment. And so one thing you can see with these scatter plots is there is a big scatter, but once you get to the high enrichment area over here, we have just a few species. I think that we have here, coyote is in the pink, red fox is in the red, the blue is the fisher. And so you just have a few species up here when you have a much larger cluster of these animals feeding mostly on natural sources. Now, these same animals, these same ones that I just mentioned, are also on this end of the scale, but at the really most enriched areas, you only tend to find them. In these middle areas, you kind of find a cluster. So this is carbon, this is nitrogen. And it looks like for Fisher, their line actually was fairly flat for nitrogen. And so they modeled sort of the overlap, like how much this is natural sort of food diet, and this is human diet. And you can see the lynx, for example, fed almost exclusively on natural food items. This is the one true carnivore in the study. The cats must eat meat and primarily only eat meat, and these other carnivores can eat other types of food items. And the lynx did not feed on human food, basically. And the wolves were very similar. Their natural food consumption did drop somewhat in the more disturbed environments, but the animals that really seemed to adapt had this overlap, okay, where they were, once they hit the human areas, they were as likely to feed on natural or human food sources. And the thing that's interesting about this is that a lot of these animals could feed on human food sources. For example, this is the marten here in panel H. They were able to feed on human food sources, but they were not often found in these environments. And so this is a study where they're trying to put pieces of a puzzle together. And so what the authors are proposing is that competition then becomes really important in structuring these communities. When red foxes and gray foxes are starting to compete for human food sources, maybe it's possible that the red foxes are tending to win that competition. Similar with the pine martens and the fishers. And so that's where the behaviors start to impact community composition in these environments and sort of the niche that these animals can exploit. Okay, now I'm going to go through some social systems that are important to understanding the conservation and biology of certain animals. And I'm going to focus here on mating systems since we haven't talked about that a whole lot. Okay, so I'm going to start with monogamy. Monogamy is a mating system that we're pretty familiar with, although it's actually not a very common mating system in much of the animal world. I'm going to start there because it's one we're familiar with. And it also so happens that birds engage in monogamy very commonly. And they're really the only group of animals that engages in monogamy so often. There are mammals that do monogamy, but it's not the most common sort of system of mating. But 90% of birds engage in monogamy. And it's interesting to ask, well, why? And sort of the common answer that people will present is that it's the cost of flying that plays an important role in this. Flying costs a lot. Birds lay eggs. They would not be able to be like placental animals and move around while they're developing young inside. This is sort of this is the scenario that people propose. The eggs are expensive to produce and they require a lot of care. And so it takes two individuals to do this. One individual can't do that alone. It requires two. And so there's a social relationship that's involved with the rearing of offspring that's conducive to monogamy. And so that's sort of the general explanation why most birds do engage in monogamy. And again, when I'm talking about monogamy, I'm talking about the pair bond, this sort of it's not an agreement, but it's this relationship between a male and a female in both mating and rearing of offspring. They do this as a pair. There are some mammals that do this too. Gibbons are a really good example of monogamous primates. They mate for life. They engage in territorial defense, feeding of offspring, and rearing. And so they are also monogamous, although most primates aren't monogamous. Another type of mating system is called polygamy. And pretty much everything that's not monogamy is called polygamy. And so this is the first word up here. And to go through these word roots, gamy. So we talked about monogamy, monogamy. Gamy refers to the number of gametes. And so in a monogamous species, you have a one and a one male, one female, two gametes, one of each sex. In polygamy, you have multiple gametes. That's all it means. So when people mention the word polygamy, all they're saying is that there are multiple male and female gametes involved in that relationship. Probably the one we sort of can think of examples most easily is polygyny. And so again, we have poly, multiple, and then gyne refers to female. And so this is a mating system where there is one male, multiple females. In birds, this is about 2% of birds have polygyny. Red-winged blackbirds are polygynous, and so they're a species you can see around here now, but you see them starting to engage in their polygynous behavior in the spring. Right now, they're quite social. They move around in flocks, but when springtime comes around, the males, and this bird with the beautiful black shiny plumage and the red epaulets, the red wing patches, this is a male. And then this brown bird here that looks kind of like a sparrow is a female. The males will establish territories in the best, hopefully at the best breeding sites. They prefer cattails around ponds and marshes and swamps. And if you've ever seen that area around a wet area of cattails, it's a pretty limited space. So this is a in high demand habitat, and there's not enough of it around for all of the male red-winged blackbirds to have a territory. And so there's intense competition. And this is what we call resource defense polygyny. And the males compete with each other. So this plumage color, the body size, and they also have these vocal displays. Those are all for other males. That signals to other males that they're already on a territory, and it tends to reduce aggression, but they do compete strongly. And so when females are mating with males, they're choosing a territory rather than choosing a male. The males that sort of occupy the very best territories will tend to have more females building nests on those territories than males that end up with lower quality territories. Another example of polygyny is orangutans, and several primates, a lot of mammals engage in different types of polygyny. And so with orangutans, you have two male morphs. And one is the adult breeder male, which is shown here. They have these facial patches, fat pads around their face. And that is an indicator that they are holding a breeding territory. And then there are other adult males in an orangutan population that look more similar to a female. And the similarity is not just in the face patches, but in body size. And so there are the males that have these fat pads this is a cue to female. So in the case of orangutans, females are actually looking for the males. They're not looking for the territory per se, but they're looking for the presence of a male that's defending a territory. And when they see one like this, they'll prefer to mate with that male, and that male is defending the territory and the females within it. Another type of polygyny is called male dominance. And these are systems in which males are not involved in the rearing of offspring at all. They're not involved in the defense of a mating territory. A nesting territory. They're not involved in anything except for reproduction, mating. And a great example from Washington State is the greater sage grouse, and that's pictured here. Greater sage grouse, the males congregate at sites called lekking grounds. L-E-K is a lek, and that is a group of males that are displaying. And so they congregate. They spend all day long displaying. So they have this fancy plumage. They have these funny vocal sacs. They make these really interesting sounds and engage in these sort of mating dances. And females visit these leks. They observe the different males displaying, and then they will decide which male to mate with. And in almost all lek systems, it's one or two males will get something like 90% of the matings, the copulations. And so if you think about the effective population size and what that means for the genetics of a population, there's a large impact, because a large amount of the genetic diversity represented in these males is not being passed along. It's only one or two males that are passing on their genes to the female population around the entire area. And that is a really important thing conservationists think about when they're trying to protect these species. Also, this behavior of lekking, um, the selection of the suitable habitat for this is really important. You have to have a lekking ground that will support the right size lek population. If there are too few males lekking, you're likely not to get a lot of female visitors. And so they protecting the lekking grounds is very important. And so this is the ways that these sorts of behaviors can really impact the population, whether it's going to grow or contract, and sort of what conservationists have to think about when they're protecting an area. When you think about um, the red-winged blackbirds and the suitable habitat they need for a territory, that's something that people have to think of when they're managing for a polygynous species that has this sort of territory defense strategy. And then it's really important to understand the dynamics between the males that are defending territory, say in orangutans, and then the males that are in the environment but not defending territories. All of these things are important things to consider when you're talking about protecting a species. Another type of polygamy is polyandry. People, you don't hear about it quite as often. There are fewer examples that we tend to draw from, but one great example are bees. Bees and social insects engage in polyandry. And what this means is multiple poly, and andry refers to males. And so this is a female mating with multiple males. And in the case of polyandrous species, it is the males that are rearing the offspring. Okay, they're often building the nests as well. And so in a polyandrous species, a female will defend a territory and the male will build a nest. On part of that territory, the female will mate with the male, and then the male takes over with the incubation of the eggs and the rearing of the offspring. And we see this in jacanas. Jacana is a kind of water bird that's found in tropical environments. They have these really large feet. They can walk on lily pads. They're somewhat related to coots. We've seen those out on the lakes, although coots don't have this mating system, but jacanas do. Some shorebirds also have a polyandrous mating system, including sometimes spotted sandpipers. Spotted sandpipers are sandpipers we can find around here in the wintertime, and females in the right conditions will engage in polyandry. This is only found in about 1% of birds, and there are not a lot of, outside of some insects, not as many examples, at least in the terrestrial animal world, but there are some. Marmosets, some of the small primates in the neotropics in the Central and South America engage in polyandry sort of opportunistically. As you can imagine, this is a little more complex with a placental mammal because the female is, has developing offspring. And so this whole idea of laying eggs in a nest and having a male take it from there doesn't really work with a mammal. But pygmy marmosets or marmosets, this is an image of pygmy marmosets, tend to have twins. And in environments where there are not offspring around from the previous years, they may engage in polyandry. And so they have a relatively short turnaround time from one breeding cycle to the next. And so they will give birth to their young, the mate with the male, give birth to the young. The male cares for the young at that point, and they move on and they find another male, produce more young. And that's the way they can engage in polyandry. They also engage in cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding is a mating system in which individuals help rear the offspring. And it's often, in most cooperative breeding systems, individuals that were born in previous years but haven't yet fully developed into adults or don't yet have a breeding territory. And one example of a cooperative breeder is the acorn woodpecker. And they are cooperative breeders, and they are also polygynandrous. So now we're putting all those words together. Polygyn, so multiple females, multiple males. And so they have this mating system where There are multiple females that are in breeding age and breeding condition that can hold that can lay eggs, and there are also multiple males. And the reason this species engages in these behaviors is because they have some really specific habitat requirements. Acorn woodpeckers are not found in our area, they're found a little further south. They have to be in an environment where there are at least like two native species of oak tree around, and they rely heavily on what they call granaries, or these dead trees where they store acorns. So they collect acorns, they drill holes, they store their acorns in these granaries, and these granaries are their food source. They're their food storage area. They're very important, and birds will compete. Different groups of acorn woodpeckers will try to steal each other's granary. So there's stiff competition for that. The birds also need suitable nesting space. So woodpeckers need suitable trees for building a cavity and laying their eggs and rearing offspring. So these two really specific requirements mean that there are limited breeding areas in an acorn woodpecker's environment because they have to have the granaries, they have to have the nest cavities. Because the resources are so limited, there are not enough territories to go around for all the adults that are in the population. That kind of scenario tends to foster things like polygamy. So you have an environment where this is limited. So you may have two or three females and two or three males breeding all together on that territory because the breeding space is so limited. Now, this sounds great. That multiple males breed with multiple females, they all raise the young. That seems like a very good strategy, and it works well for the woodpeckers. But when you actually look at their behaviors, there is a lot of competition that's happening in that system. The behavior does not always seem very cooperative. And so, one example is this behavior that they call egg tossing. They also have egg eating happening. And so, female acorn woodpeckers that are breeding in the group will often lay their eggs together in a communal nest. Again, nest spots, nest cavities are limiting, so they're sharing a nest cavity. But early in the nesting season, it's usually one female will lay the first egg. Okay, and you will have a period of time over a few weeks where one female at a time may be ready to lay an egg. When there is only one egg in a nest, what tends to happen is the likelihood that that egg sticks around is almost zero, because other females, if a female who hasn't laid an egg comes in that nest and sees an egg, it will toss the egg out of the nest or it will eat the egg. And this continues to happen. Say another female the next day lays an egg. The females that haven't laid an egg that day, they come, they inspect, they see there's one egg that they know they didn't lay, they toss it or eat it. And this continues until at least two females lay an egg on the same day. Once both of those eggs are in the nest, people are guessing the reason the eggs no longer get tossed or eaten is that the females can't tell which egg is theirs. If there's a third female in that sort of system that hasn't yet laid an egg, she may toss both of them. And so it's not until all of the breeding females have laid an egg in that nest that there's no more of the egg tossing happening. And so that's competition. Also, one of the benefits of that is the eggs are all going to probably hatch at the same time because one wasn't laid the day before. And in instances where an egg hatches early, the young that hatches early from an egg tends to have a pretty big benefit over other young in the nest. They get one extra day of food. They tend to grow a bit faster. They tend to be able to beg for food a bit more effectively. And so the synchronous sort of egg laying and hatching does have a benefit to the group overall, even though the egg tossing seems pretty pretty stiff competition. Because these territories are so limited, young from the year before often can't find a territory, and these birds are quite aggressive, so they will stick around in their parents' territory, and they will help to raise the offspring, and they'll often continue to do this until some um, adult dies in their population or in a nearby group. And then they go and they try to become a breeder in that group. And this is a case with acorn woodpeckers where that's as likely to happen within their family group as it is outside of their family group. So there can be a fair amount of inbreeding in acorn woodpeckers due to the limited resources in the mating system. So all of these elements are really important when you're thinking about modeling population growth of this species, because you can't just go out and count the numbers of young and the numbers of adults and the numbers of males and females. Probably males and females might tell you something, but you can't use that information in a sort of standard population model to predict growth, because not all the adults in the population are actually breeding. So you need to know about that behavior. And there are quite a number of cooperative breeding endangered species. And so when people are thinking about a management plan to bring them back, they need to know that when they're talking about what we call effective population size. You may have 100 individuals or 1,000 individuals, but the effective size, the size of the population that's actually producing individuals, is much smaller than that. And I'm just going to close with sort of highlighting that there are lots of other social systems that you can learn about. There are entire classes on primate social systems and mammalian social systems if you're interested in this kind of behavior. And so elephants are a really good example of interesting social systems. You probably know that they are what we would call K-selected. These are long-lived animals. They take a long time to reach maturity, and they have a very slow interbirth interval, so that the time between a female giving birth to one offspring, always one offspring, and the next time period is a very long time. They have extensive parental care, and they also have complex social systems. So with African elephants, they have what they call a fission fusion society. This is also found in primates and some other animals that engage in a lot of learned behavior. And the sort of primary social unit with elephants is a matriarch. So this is a female, and they tend to move in these female groups of a matriarch and often several adult relatives of that matriarch, maybe sisters, may even be daughters, it depends. And then those females' offspring. Okay. And so that includes males. And so adult males, can form social groups as well. The adult males are sort of on the periphery of these core female territories, looking for opportunities to mate with females. And there is competition. There are sort of territorial males that sort of are the ones that are primarily mating with groups of females. And then there are younger males that are sort of waiting for an opportunity to do that. And so understanding that complex social structure has been really important with managing elephants. For example, there are elephants that are part of captive breeding programs to keep them healthy. Like a herd is always in a captive environment an artificial thing. So people have to be really careful when they think of trying to construct something like an all-female group. In the wild, this sort of social system can have shifts in it due to poaching or some kind of disturbance, can have a really big impact on the functioning of that social unit. So for example, the removal of a matriarch from a social unit can cause a lot of shifts and changes in that unit that might mean the disappearance of it sometimes. There was an interesting study about, I don't know, some time ago, not that long ago, on male social units. So the males live with the females until they're about 9 to 14 years old. At that point, they start to become independent, and they'll join these all male herds. And these male herds have older and younger males part of them. Okay. And tends to be so when older males are removed from those herds, this is usually through poaching. or through some kind of death of the older male, if it's often human caused death, then the younger males they've found tend to get into more sort of human animal conflict. They tend to raid crops around villages and cause a bit more destruction. And so there were a series of popular headlines when this study first came out about the teenage elephants need male adult figures to moderate their behavior. But that actually they've seen this in various studies at this point, that social structure is actually really important to the conservation of the animal, helping that animal avoid more human conflict. So, little introduction to behavior in wildlife conservation. We'll be looking at that more this week, and I hope you've enjoyed it.